Good afternoon to everyone. Sorry, I didn't know the micro was so strong. We are going to have this session. I think it's going to be very interesting because we are going to talk about adaptive management, but more than that, we are going to talk about monitoring associated with adaptive management, what I think is very, very important because I don't believe that we can adapt our management without monitoring how nature is reacting to our ideas about how to manage it. So I think it's very important, and we have a very good set of specialists. We have Toddy Stillman. She's Dean from the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University from North Carolina, US. Then we have Jesus San Miguel. I think that everyone working in fires in Europe knows him. He works at the JRC and is responsible for the EFISH. And then they will give their speech in the start of the session. And then we have a kind of round table. And we will have with us from New Zealand, we have Tim Mitchell from the Fire and Emergency. And from South Africa, we have Etienne Dutoit from the South Africa Fire Service. So, please, Jesus, you are the first one.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here at this conference. It is always good to meet so many people you've been working with for so long and you hardly see because we are all so busy. So it's very good. It's an excellent meeting point to meet colleagues that they work on wildfire. I have prepared a short presentation on our experience from the European Union in not managing, because we kind of work from remote. You will see our activities are really based on remote sensing, geographic information systems, but the activities of the Commission in trying to monitor wildfires in an area so big as the European Union, which is now 27 countries. I can pass the slides here. Okay, so a short outline. Don't be afraid, it is not that long. I will talk a little bit about monitoring and the problems we found when we established monitoring and what we think it is important in monitoring and the stability of the data and the continued link with policies. Then a little bit about past and present. Because we started, as a European Union, we started working on setting up a system for Europe in 1998. So it's now 25 years. And everything has changed. And I will show a little bit how that went. Then I will talk a little bit about the influence of changes in technology. Since the 90s until now, everything has changed also. The importance of research and innovation. Many of you are professionals, and you see that it's always interesting to have innovation, but it's not always possible to incorporate them in operational management. And then the approach that we have taken as European Union. I will explain a little bit how the European Union works, but it is a complicated scheme, and the decision at the end as relates forest management and forest fires is always in the hands of the countries. So we as European Commission, kind of federal government, have very little power to influence. So we have to develop through cooperation. And I will show how that is still going after 25 years, and how this approach that we have developed in Europe is being now implemented in other regions of the world, like Latin America and the Caribbean. And then a few challenges for further development. So wildfire monitoring. What we need for consistent wildfire monitoring. Something that is needed is that either science or experience is at the base of what we have, so that whatever we are producing in terms of monitoring, it is accepted, it is respected, it has a solid base. And in many cases, it is science, but in the case of forest fires, also in many cases, it's experience. The experience that the fire managers have collected in the field, and that in many cases may not be published. There is kind of a lot of great literature that is essential for fires. Then the science policy interface from the start. It is very difficult to do work on research, to work on science, develop something, and then in the last moment try to incorporate that into something operational. Because operational people are busy. They have their own methods. It's very difficult to change them. Then what do we need? We need continuity. If we are supporting policies, we cannot have a system that is providing data for 1 year and then the next year there is no funding. So we cannot keep on providing data. Policies, once they are established, they need continuous flow of data. So it is essential that whatever system is developed for monitoring is maintained over time. And then you will see in the case of forest fires, but in any other case, science has been changing dramatically from the 90s until now. And the systems cannot be stable. A system that is stable, that is set up in a given way and maintained over the years becomes obsolete in very little time. So we need to have science and development at the basis of the system. And then what is important is also the publication and dissemination of the data. It is really worthless having a lot of very interesting data if these data are not used by the majority of people that could use the data. So publishing and making the data available is as essential as producing the data. And that is one of the main goals that we have had in the European Forest Fire Information System, making the data available for all types of users. And then support them, because in many cases, well, in all cases, when you're dealing with complex data, and data for fires are very complex because fires have many different phases, the users need support. They need to be trained. They need to be informed on how the data work, how we're developed. And that is essential too. Then a little bit about past and present. And I like to show this slide because these were the fire danger maps that were elaborated in 1998. Those were operational maps developed in 5 European countries. The way in which the information was distributed was through fax. So those maps were sent by fax to Brussels, to the Commission, and in the Commission, someone distributed the maps to all the countries so that they would share information. And that is when we started working with the countries and discussing with them what can we do to improve the situation. At that time, geographic information systems were quite basic, and remote sensing was also quite basic. So it was difficult to convince them to get to something that is what we have now. We have at that time, everything was done more or less by hand. In the times we are having now, we have a continuous update, for instance, of metadata. We have hourly data. We can produce forecasts for deterministic up to 10 days, probabilistic even 6 months. So this type of flow of information was not existing at that time. So that is a big change. And what we are doing in Europe has become feasible at the global level. So we are able to monitor in real time fires globally. And you can see some of the ongoing fires, for instance, in Alberta, or fires in Central America. Where you see the little white circles, those are areas in which there are fires larger than 10,000 hectares. So, and this is possible in near real time. So we update this system up to 8 times every day at the global level. Obviously, that was not foreseeable many years ago. So what has changed? Something that has changed is clearly technology. Science has also changed. So the indices that were used in Europe, and those were the ones that were published in the maps, are not used any longer. So those indices have been replaced in most cases by the Fire Weather Index. Although some countries keep on computing some national indices, even at the regional level, there are regional indices. But science has changed a lot. The audience of the fire data we produced has changed completely. Before, the data were produced for fire managers. Now we have a much wider audience. We have all kinds of agencies that are interested in data. scientists, enterprises, insurance companies. Everybody's interested in getting data for fires. And that is why dissemination of the data is essential. And what has changed also is the fires that we are having now. So we have to keep on updating science because we are facing fires. If you look at the literature or if you look at the news, we are talking about unprecedented fires since 2016, at least. So the fires in Chile were unprecedented, the fires in Portugal, they were unprecedented, the fires in Sweden in 2018, unprecedented, the same in Mati in Greece. All these fires never happened before. So we clearly have to update our science. So how is technology, how that has influenced the monitoring? Data availability is everywhere. So what we have is data, all kinds of data in all kinds of format. It's even dangerous because processing data, putting a lot of data in a model and trying to use something that comes out of the model without the proper rationale is even dangerous. For instance, for our satellite remote sensing, we have data from 5 meters to 2 kilometers, at least 20 different sources. And what I placed here is FIRMS. FIRMS is the NASA system to distribute the data that I think most fire managers are using for active fires, for burnt area mapping, but also Copernicus. In terms of computational power, as I said before, what we were doing in the 90s, from there, we could not foresee that we would be computing a much better outputs at the global level with better data. So remote sensing has evolved a lot in the last 20 years, but computational power has done the same. That is what allows us to monitor in real time the situation everywhere in the world. And I showed before, below, some graphs that immediately, because the data are processed and the data are made into graphs or maps. And you have the example of Australia. That is a project we developed with NASA to look at fire regimes globally. And finally, dissemination of the data. Dissemination of the data is immediate. So as soon as we have data published in a system, it is immediately in Twitter. It is immediately in the media. It is in LinkedIn. It's in YouTube. And I just included a couple of examples. The top one is the smoke distribution of the fires in Alberta that I got from a TV station. So this data, as I said, the data that in the past were for fire managers, now is data that are used by all kinds of different communities. And I would like to now, going into policies, explain a bit how the European Union works, because I think we, within the European Commission, we tend to believe that everybody knows how we are organized, and I don't think that is the case. So we have in the European Union now 27 countries, around 450 million people. So it's about half of the size of the United States with over 2 times the population. So Europe is a very populated area, and that for fires is no good. Then in terms of organization, we have several entities within the European Union, which are the European Council, so this is the prime ministers of all the 27 countries. The Council of the European Union, for instance, met in September last year, civil protection, to duplicate the forest fighting aerial means of the European Union. So that is the Council of the EU. Then we have the European Parliament to discuss legislation, and then we have the European Commission and other entities. In the European Commission, we are organized on kind of ministries, but instead of being called ministries, they are called Directorate Generals. And we have Directorate General for Agriculture that deals with the Common Agricultural Policy, but this is the one that is funding most of the activities on forest fires. Most of the money that goes to forest fires comes from DG Agri. Then the environment in charge of forest monitoring, forest management, and forest fires, climate change, eco, civil protection. You have had presentations from my colleagues in civil protection on how we are organized this summer. Then regional policies, because areas that suffer natural hazards have a possibility of request funds from the Commission. reform is implementing a very interesting project here in Portugal with different pilot regions in which an additional effort is being made to even improve the situation you have here in Portugal, that I think is very good. For the time being, it has worked very well. So I really hope it continues like that. And then we have the Joint Research Center. The Joint Research Center is the technical body of the European Union, and we are supposed to support all policies. So all these other ministers or DGs are the ones defining the policies, and we have to support them by creating data to monitor the fires. So we are around 2,800 people at the ERC and around 60,000 in all the institutions. And we have all kinds of policies, civil protection mechanism, that is the mechanism that helps countries to collaborate. So countries are sharing means all throughout the fire season, ground means, aerial means, and that is coordinated through the civil protection mechanism. We have the EU forest strategy, we have the climate change strategy, bioeconomy, land use changes in forestry, structural and solidarity funds. When there is a major disaster, countries can ask for solidarity fund. And the case of forest fires, for instance, in Portugal 2003 or 2005, or Cyprus 2 years ago are clear examples. And then the Green Deal, that is more international. So many policies. And these many policies produce a lot of legislation. And all this legislation need data. All these rules, all these regulations, they are called regulations at the European level, need data. They need data first to be drafted, and they need data to be monitored through time. So the monitoring of fire is really essential to devise policies. Research and innovation. Research and innovation for us, I work in a joint research center, so I work in a research center. And for us, it's very important that research is always close to operation. In all the steps, in fire danger, and as I said, the fire danger indices that were computed in the past, they are not computed anymore. So in most countries, we have the fire weather index. Active fire detection is changing completely. We used to have we still have watchtowers. Then there are aerial means. Then we have all kinds of satellites. We have cameras. So fire detection is an activity in itself. All the different phases of fire management are really fields of activity, huge fields. So that's why, and fires are transversal. That's why it's complicated. Then burnt area mapping from airborne, and also fire severity rating from all kinds of satellite, damages to land cover, emissions from forest fires, soil erosion, all these byproducts of the mapping of burnt areas are essential for all kinds of policies that are not really related directly to fire, but are affected by fire. And a lot of data from these activities go into different policies. And something that is not very well developed is the evaluation of fire losses. We were really pushing for this at the European level because we wanted to give a value of how much the European Union loses every year from forest fires. The figure we have now that is very, very conservative is around 3 billion, so around 3,000 million every year, just from the land cover damage. We are not able to estimate the value of biodiversity. We are not estimating the value of lives lost by fires. So there are many, many other factors that are not included in the equation and that should be. So it is something we want to further develop. And then you have the economy of forest fires. That includes also firefighting. So firefighting is a huge economy. It's really very expensive, but it's needed. So it's not, we cannot say, no, we shouldn't invest in firefighting, we should do just prevention. We have to work on all the phases. And then all this data should be included in some type of a monitoring system. And that is what we are trying to do. And what the approach we've taken in the European Union, in the European Commission, is to work through cooperation. As I mentioned at the beginning, the European Commission, as such, has no power to infer rules in how member states, the European countries, have to do on prevention, forest management, firefighting. What we do is cooperate with them. And that is, I think, has been a success because countries are happy with this approach, and we are also happy. It's the only way to really progress. And we are working with them in all the different phases. In FAO, they have now the 5 Rs, but which are kind of very similar to prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, damage assessment, and rehabilitation. And one example of this cooperation is the European Forest Fire Information System. As I said, we started working on this in 1998, and we've been cooperating with the countries, and not only with the fire managers in the countries, but also with the research institutions and organizations in the country for now 25 years. We have as a basis of this cooperation what is called the Expert Group on Forest Fires. We started, from the slide that I showed at the beginning, we started with 7 countries, working with 5 Mediterranean countries, Germany and Finland, in 1998. And now the network is made of 43 countries in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. And that was thanks also to FAO. FAO Silva Mediterranea helped the expansion of the system to areas that were beyond the European territory. So that is. And we meet twice every year. We discuss, we had the meeting here on the 16th, on Tuesday. We discuss how countries are organized for this firefighting campaign, campaigns for fire prevention, awareness campaigns, just to know how every country is organized and to learn from each other. And then we meet after the fire campaign, which in Europe is normally ending in October. It's getting longer and longer every year. But after October, November, we can meet and then evaluate the campaign. At that time, normally we publish an annual report on the situation of the previous year, when we have some information from this year. Something that, as I said, we are doing is publishing reports. And these reports are published by the European Commission and the countries that are part of this network. They're called Forest Fires in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. The first one was in 2000. And the last one for 2021 was in 2022, published 1 year later. For me, what you can see that is interesting is that the first report is forest fires in Southern Europe, because fires were not the problem for Central or Northern Europe. So we were focusing in Southern Europe, because that is where the problem was. And it was signed by the Commissioner for Environment, because environment was the one that was really interested in forest fires in relation to forest damages. Now in 2022, we have a wild and urban interface fire that was not so common when we started, and we see the report signed by 3 different commissioners. The Commissioner for Research and Innovation, the Commissioner for Civil Protection, and the Commissioner for Environment, meaning that clearly the interest in forest fires has been expanding continuously from the 2000 until now. In terms of goals and key performance indicators, that was a little bit the topic of this session. What we intend to do is to provide accurate data and information to support the full cycle of all kinds of fire management and policies. And also to help fire managers, decision makers, academia, research, media, to have sound data on which they can base their opinion or their decisions. What we've seen, especially in the last years, is the proliferation of media using data directly from EFIs. That didn't happen in the past. Now they are even elaborated their own data. We see really nice graphs every summer or produced by these media reporters. They have a research kind of groups within the media, and they elaborate their own data, which is a clear sign of the interest of this topic, not only for the managers or for us that are dealing with forest fires, but for the overall society. Otherwise, media will not be paying so much attention. And other type of indicators we have is the web analytics. And you can see these are monthly data. We have in July 2022 over 500,000 visitors in the system, meaning that a system that was built by fire managers and the European Commission for fire managers is really used by everyone. It's used by any regular citizen that is interested on forest fires or interested in knowing if there is going to be a very high risk of fire in a given area. Tourism organizations, they look at the system and foresee when they have the trips. It's really unbelievable how the data are used and could not have been foreseen. And another thing we are doing, I don't want to extend the presentation too long, we are doing the same approach we did in Europe. We've been working for 25 years in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we started discussing with the countries in the region on the possibility of establishing an expert group on forest fires and work with a regional system that in this case could be the Global Wildfire Information System. We started when the pandemic was in place, and then all the meetings were virtual. But then there was really a lot of enthusiasm of all the countries. And we have progressed through that, and we have had already 3 physical meetings, the first one in Santiago in 2022, then in Brasilia, organized by IBAMA at the end of last year. And then we had the 4th meeting of this group here also on Monday and Tuesday. And on Tuesday, we had this joint session of the 2 groups. Because at the basis of these groups is really cooperation, sharing of information, sharing of good practices. And I think that is the way to go to progress in fire management. But we have still some challenges to go. We want to replicate the success we had in Europe in these other regions. We have also a delegation of ASEAN countries coming to the JRC in Ispra next week. They are here. So there is cooperation in other regions, not only LAC. Then we are also cooperating intensively with the countries, but also with international organizations that are already working in the region, like FAO or UNEP or the Amazon Treaty Cooperation Organization. We are also cooperating not only with this, but in the Amazon region, because I didn't really have a good knowledge of how things were implemented in the region, there are so many donors. There are cooperation organizations from all kinds of countries, from Germany, from Switzerland, from Spain, from Italy, plus green funds. There is a lot of money there because the world is very concerned with the region. And it's important to have everyone on board. So that is important for us. And then we started with one program of the Commission that is called Fire Policy Instrument. But now we are going to continue these activities, meeting again, with the European Group on Forest Fires in Europe. We will meet twice every year and discuss on the situation on the countries. The group has already established its own network through WhatsApp. They did that in the first meeting. It's amazing. They're already sharing a lot of information, a lot of communication in webinars, and we intend to continue this activity at least until 2027 under a program of the European Union that is called Team Europe Initiative on the Amazon, or Amazonia Plus. And we want to keep on working on the Global Wildfire Information System. As I mentioned at the beginning, systems that are based on technology have to be dynamic because they keep on evolving. So the system FEs of the year 2000 didn't have anything to do with the system we have now. And we are having more data, more satellites being launched. So better data to have better assessment and hopefully to have a better prediction of the conditions under which fires evolve, and hoping that that will help in mitigating the damage by forest fires. And that's all on my side. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jesus, for this very interesting summary of what is being done at the JRC. Before giving the word to Toddy, I would like to remember the audience that you are very welcome to make questions in your app so that at the end of the presentations I can use your questions. Toddy, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Dean of the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, an American university. I was also the past president of the International Association for Wildland Fire. And for about 25 years, I'm a social scientist, and I've done work on community responses to wildfire, as well as how do we create more safe and effective wildland fire management. response. And so it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about policy and governance, because that's what I've spent my career doing. And the opportunity to talk on a platform like this is really special to me, because I've never had this opportunity. So I want to start, I'm talking about governance and how it interfaces with management. So the title of the panel is Wild Adaptive Management, but I think governance is what drives management, and so the two are intersecting in that way. So that's what I wanted to make my focus. The goal, and I think it's always important to start with goals, is a just, effective, accountable, and adaptive governance system for wildland fire management. And so that's kind of the North Star for my presentation today. And this has been covered sufficiently, but the reason we care about some of these things is because we're seeing greater impacts and consequences for humans as well as ecosystems. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think we've covered it pretty well. And we know why this is happening. It's a very complex system. A combination of factors contributes to this, from land, forest, timber management, climate change, and human habitation, among others. But the real issue is, what is the governance problem? That's sort of the socio-ecological problem. The question is, what is the governance problem that we're trying to address? First, before we consider that, I think it's important to think about, why do we even care about governance? So governance is really the institutions that rule us. They're the rule, the processes, the procedures that guide our behavior. And in some ways, we don't have bad management, we just have bad governance. Because our institutions are set up to direct us, and we get the behaviors that we design. So it's important that we think about that. And if we're dealing with large collective action problems, which is what we deal with in the wildland fire system, it's important to think about what those systems are. It's also important to remember that government is not equivalent to governance. Government is one actor when we think about governance at large, which is comprised of many different actors. And then institutional change really rests within structures, incentive, and cultures. So it's a very complex system that we think about. So with that as the background, that we're really going to focus today, at least my talk, on the governance system, is I want to define the governance problem. I'm going to talk about the growing convergence that we have around what we need to be doing with wildland fire governance. How do we get smarter faster? How do we map out future action? And what are the tensions as we move in that general direction? So some of this is also very familiar. It was covered this morning and in other places, just in terms of what the governance problem is. And I would say there are really 5 intertwining issues that we face. And so I'm going to cover those in turn. And I'm going to start with fragmentation. We have 2 different kinds of fragmentation. Geographic fragmentation, which I think is pretty familiar to most of us. That's because we have multiple jurisdictions and multiple actors, rights holders, stakeholders that need to be involved. But we also have sectoral fragmentation. So our land use management systems don't talk to our air quality systems, that don't talk to our economic development systems or our restoration science and management systems. So we have a couple of different types of fragmentation that we need to address. We also have a lot of socio-ecological forcings in our system that I think call into question how localities can even act. So wildland fire management is a profoundly local problem. We have local response agencies, local communities, local land use, and local culture, but they are at the bottom of what is a system that has a lot of forcing of what I would call in it. So you have regional, national, and global influences that press down onto your ability to respond at the local level. So we've just been talking about, the United Nations and what climate change could possibly is, how it affects areas. We've talked about the EU and the different systems that come into play there. Also at the regional level, we have activity that comes into play, all of which creates a very complicated system for an actor at the local level in terms of the kind of change or action that they can take. And so in some ways, people have actually called into question whether or not how much control localities actually have when you think about the complexity of the system into which they need to react. We also have an institutional mismatch. We've talked a little bit about that so far today as well. We're seeing rapid ecological change in our systems, and there's institutional sluggishness or rigidity in the system to respond to that, which creates this gap in action. And we know from a governance perspective that that is something that we also need to address. And then we have a very resilient suppression culture, and this is something that has been covered also in the literature pretty well. We have a fire protection, fire suppression, and fire exclusion system that creates these feedbacks into reducing the amount of hazardous fuel that we have, increasing the kind of settlements that we get, and so it's a reinforcing system that is very complex in its own nature, and it's a very resistant and resilient system in its own right. And then finally, we have an ad hoc governance approach, ad hoc approach to governance. There's been an increased amount of writing on governance in the literature. There's a really wonderful article by Judith Kirschner, which I'll call out, that was very helpful to me, where we see an increasing number of people writing about governance as a percentage of overall work related to wildland fire. And that convergence I would refer to around the larger title of good and adaptive governance. That, I think we have a growing convergence that this is what we need to be doing. And so then the question is, well, what does that actually look like? What is good and adaptive governance? And in the synthesis of the literature out there, I identified 5 general principles: inclusiveness, fairness, scale, responsibility, and adaptiveness. And I'll walk you through those because I think this becomes really important. And I've put sort of a compass up there because I think what we need is a North Star of sorts that guides us when we think about what kind of governance do we really want so we don't replicate the problems of the past. And so I'm going to start with inclusiveness, which is really about social processes that incorporate participation by diverse interests. That includes our stakeholders, our rights holders, and others. Means we can deal with those fragmentation issues, collaboration across boundaries, the incorporation of diverse knowledges, while keeping in mind that access, equity, and representation are really important, but this is about process. So this criterion is really about inclusiveness and process. It's distinguished from fairness, which is really about equity and outcome. And so fairness is really dealing with accounting for historical path dependencies and place-based differences that come with all sorts of power relationships that we need to take into account. And that usually gets translated in our work to differentials in human capacity at the local level or social capacity at the local level. And again, that's really about equity and outcomes. Taking into account scale, where we need to match the scale of the problem with the scale of the institutional approach. That comes with that criterion. And then responsibility is, are we actually effective in what we are seeking to do? Are we actually accomplishing the things that we set out to do? As well as thinking about the legitimacy of the actors in this arena and the accountability that is built into it. That usually comes through greater transparency. Adaptiveness is the last criterion, where we can demonstrate capacity for learning, innovation, in an anticipatory, forward-looking way, not looking to the past, but what is ahead of us, and how do we think about what is coming so that we can align our structures and incentives consistent with those intentions. So I would say those are the 5 principles that are expressed in this growing literature and convergence around governance. I think there is also growing convergence in the policy sphere when we look to see what is happening in terms of policy. And so wildland fire policy, I would say there are 4 areas: creating fire-resilient landscapes. So if we look at the international literature, again, these are 4 areas where I see growing convergence. Creating fire-resilient landscapes, creating fire-resilient communities, facilitating safe and effective fire response. And this last one is the one that has been, I think in the last 2 to 5 years, I've really seen creeping up in the literature. Restoring rural livelihoods and restoring indigenous and cultural fire regimes. I think those last 2 actually should be 2 separate points now. That's just the way my own thinking has matured on this. But I think we've got growing convergence about those policy goals. So the question then is, how can we get smarter, faster about all of these things? Because time is growing short. Can we use insights from good and adaptive governance to accelerate our learning for a more just, effective, and timely impact? So that's sort of the North Star orientation. And the only way we do that is by working at those management actions that really come through specific policy interventions. And this is how we create the adaptive management to adaptive governance loop. So good and adaptive governance, again, those 5 prisms are used, and we've talked through that. Who is involved in decision making? For whom is the intervention effective? At what scale is the intervention? Responsibility, is the theory of change clear? Is it working? And adaptiveness, how does the structure demonstrate adaptiveness, anticipatory thinking, and capacity for learning? So those are questions that we could ask ourselves about any policy to see how it is performing for us. And so together, those two things create what I will call the smarter, faster matrix, right? So if we use on the vertical, the policies that we know we need, and we use on the horizontal the criteria by which we judge them, I think that allows us to get smarter faster in terms of the progress that we are making. And by way of example, there's a really terrific article by Cheng and Dale that looked at the Colorado Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant Program. And this would fall under the policies of resilient landscape projects. And we can all probably think of projects that fall into this arena. But one of the things that they did was unpack sort of some of the governance pieces, and I've overlaid my framework on top of this. When it comes to inclusiveness and fairness, what they found out of their grant program in Colorado was there was a bias towards higher capacity organizations and communities, and that capacity begets capacity, which creates inequities in community capacity. So that becomes an action item in terms of paying attention for future work. On scale, what they found was they institutionalized scale mismatches in terms of which communities could support what kinds of action. So you only have so much community capacity at the local level, which means you don't have sufficient capacity at the regional level, and that's where you need to build capacity. So that becomes an action item in terms of where we need to build capacity. Responsibility, they demonstrated reduction in crown fire, but a heightened risk for surface fuels. So you can sort of see when you think about what is your theory of change and action, what is working and what is not working. And then finally, in terms of adaptiveness, they had limited capacity to actually adapt due to structural barriers within the system. So overall, I think that the framework allows us to get smarter faster in terms of what are some of the barriers that allow us further progress. And so if you were to walk through all of the dimensions of the policies that we have, whether they're fire-adapted communities and use those 5 dimensions, or safe and effective wildland fire response and the 5 dimensions, or restoring rural livelihoods and indigenous cultural fire regimes, I think we would start to really move towards a more comprehensive understanding and action of what we need to do things better. So again, that's how the matrix works. In terms of the policies being on the vertical and on the horizontal, the criteria for evaluating them. So just coming back to the problem, we have those 5 problems: fragmentation, socio-ecological forcings, institutional mismatch, a resilient suppression culture, and ad hoc understanding of governance. I've tried to synthesize today the governance approach so that it's a little bit less ad hoc, along with what Judith Kirchner has encouraged us to do as well. And I think this allows us to map future action. And there are some inherent tensions that I would predict or hypothesize that would crop up if we move in this general direction, including inclusiveness and scale. So the more inclusive we try to be, the harder it is at larger scales. So there are going to be some inherent tensions. And similarly, when we try to balance fairness with responsibility, if we try to be most effective, there are going to be certain communities that are going to be deprioritized over others. And so there are inherent tensions there. And then finally, in terms of scale and adaptiveness, the larger scale we get, the harder it is to adapt. Because there are certain limitations to scale. And so I think instead of trying to solve for all of these things, I think what we need to do is embrace the inherent tensions that will be existing in the system and then learn how to manage for them. In addition, the notion of fragmentation, I think, continues to be something that we need to have sensitivities toward. There's an open question about what is the scale of socio-ecological forcing to limit local action or not? And I think that's something ripe for continued investigation. And then this question for institutional mismatch. How do we create those laddered organizations that Jesus just very eloquently, I think, illustrated for us to make progress? And then I think the real area that is ripe for further investigation is restoring rural livelihoods and indigenous and cultural fire regimes. Because until we actually get to the land use, scale, and management side of this, I think our ability to make change and do more fully integrated change is going to be very, very challenging. So at the end of the day, the goal here that I wanted to lay out for us is a just, effective, accountable, adaptive governance system. We need a map that moves us in the right direction. I feel like the map that moves us in the right direction are our policies, where we have growing convergence. And then we need a compass to keep us on track, which are the different criteria when we think about good and adaptive governance. So the policy and the good adaptive governance criteria provide some very good guidance for us, I think, as we take these next steps. So how do we move forward? And this is my last slide, so we can move on to questions. I think that what's needed are regional to global working groups who can harvest lessons and learn to accelerate this kind of learning. So for my friends who are in the global governance community, I feel like this is a research agenda for us to undertake. And those working groups need to be comprised of scholars, practitioners, and managers. We need more global representation, and I think conferences like this do an excellent job of pulling in underrepresented perspectives that we often do not get in the published literature, especially in terms of those from the global south. Africa, the continent of Africa, is underrepresented. China is underrepresented, as is Russia. And I think we all need lessons from these areas if we are going to make progress as a global community. And with that, I'll leave it, and we can move on to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toddy. I encourage the audience to make questions because I don't have any yet. Now, we would like to know something about the experience in other parts of the world, and I will start with Tim to tell us something about how you deal with this problem in New Zealand.
Yeah, and I guess like everyone, be nice to have the answer for that one because it is incredibly complex. I think part of the challenge we have is that we get caught up in so much of the day-to-day, what's going on, what's happening. We don't necessarily give ourselves a lot of time as managers or people who are involved in managing that fire regime to actually think ahead or look at what's perhaps coming and sort of do that forward-looking, forward planning. Yeah, with a lot of priorities, a lot of issues that are sort of happening currently, it does make it quite a challenging space to really step back and then look ahead and look around the corners for what might be coming. Obviously, the research is critical to underpin, give us the knowledge to form our policies and processes. But again, if we don't give them the time to actually do the quality of research that we need to underpin a lot of what we're doing, then we're falling ourselves short of coming up with really great sound solutions. So I absolutely do love the concept of how we bring researchers, policy analysts, those into our day-to-day environments so that they are, I guess, seeing what we're seeing, that we're not trying to bridge these large gaps that we get where policy seems to be off in their own little isolated space, working by themselves, or the researchers working on a particular project or activity, when they complete that research, which might be a year or 3 years down the track, their knowledge is up here, but yet the rest of the industry is down here because they hasn't necessarily been taken on that journey. So I think it's some of the ways in which we're working and operating, and how I guess we're working more cohesively to try and sort of address some of those issues, those challenges. I think it's also we tend to stay in our own little silos. We're not necessarily engaging with our stakeholders and our partners. And when I say our partners, I'm meaning everyone else in this room, because it's not just the issues that are happening in our country. From what we've heard from a lot of the sessions today, climate change is affecting New Zealand as much as Australia, US, Canada, and all the other countries here. So there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of information that's being gained, but yet the platforms are not quite there to share it. So, we are working really hard to try and improve those sharing arrangements, but there's still work to be done in that space. And I think if we had more access to that data, we had greater ability to have those cross-boundary conversations, that would certainly help. And it's not that anyone's doing it any better. It's that everyone's doing it differently. And it's the differences that often give us the tool or the solution to help resolve the problem.
Yeah, thank you. Etienne?
I think, from the perspective of a resource-poor country, the question is, how do you adapt? Do you adapt by constantly improving? And the improvement cycle is basically what we rely on, utilizing the existing resources to address all the focal areas that we need to focus on. So I always use a practical example of how we do it with the limited resources we have, and I like to refer to the 5+1s. So it's the 5 E's plus then the 6th E. So we start with the 6th one, which is evaluation. So we have to evaluate the focal areas constantly. And the first focal area, that is where science and academic research comes to the fore, and we incorporate data in our planning. That is the first E, which is engineering. So there we incorporate science, technology, and engineering solutions, and we try and engineer a solution to take forward. And that will then inform the first focal area policy. The next one is then obviously the education. Politicians, general public, and it's basically a whole of society approach, which we try to target with the education component. Then the third component is the enforcement. That is where your regulations and your legislation comes to the fore, and the enablers to enable policy to be enforced. Once those areas are addressed, then we obviously come to the fourth area, which is the 4th E, which is economic incentives. So we try and incentivize communities to comply out of own free will and hopefully comply and introduce what policy dictates. And then obviously the last area is, if all those fail, then that is your emergency response, which is the 5th E. So if your first 4 fail, that is then the emergency response only kicks in. So it's more proactive approach and a more practical approach which we utilize, which informs policy. Once that cycle is completed, obviously we evaluate each one of those areas, and that is where the improvement is then made. So that will inform policy. If we need to amend regulations or legislation, that is where that is identified and then targeted. So that is the approach, and in saying that, we are part of the global village. We have the same problems, we share the same challenges, but we have fewer resources. And that is one of the bigger challenges, and that is obviously where the international cooperation is very important. And events like this is obviously that informs the next step in policies. So in a nutshell, that is a more practical approach that in South Africa, a regional approach in the Western Cape that we follow.
Now I have many questions. Okay, so I have here one first question. I don't know who wants to answer. So the question is about restoring cultural and indigenous fire practices. And who made the question? These jumped, the questions that have more votes jumped. So the question I was reading just jumped below. Okay, so he mentioned that restoring cultural and indigenous fire practice has received strong support, but maybe in too much of a blind way. There's plenty to learn from those practices, indeed, but also historical examples of negative and sometimes very destructive impacts, ecological and for livelihoods. What do you think about that?
I'm sorry, so can you summarize? I'm having a hard time.
It's difficult to read it the first time and then to summarize. So they are talking about the importance of restoring cultural and indigenous fire practices. And he or she mentions that this topic has received too much attention, but that there are also some examples where restoring the cultural and indigenous fire practice did not work in the right way.
I see. Okay, so it's sort of a critique of historical, cultural, indigenous fire practices. So, I mean, I think we can look, I mean, I know the history of this certainly in the United States, and I can speak from that perspective, and I'm reluctant to speak from another perspective, but historically we know that indigenous as well as cultural burning, and I consider indigenous burning by Native American tribes, and cultural burning is by agricultural practitioners, foresters, and farmers. So just so I'm defining my own terms, because those terms mean different things to different people. We know that those practices were suppressed, in their own right at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. There used to be very lively and active practices by both indigenous peoples and agricultural and foresters and farmers through systemic efforts by the U.S. Forest Service as well as others to basically promote a suppression culture. And I think as part of that effort, there was a lot of, at least initial propaganda, I would say, about how destructive those practices were. And I think we also live with some of those myths today. Now, that is not to say that we haven't had escaped prescribed fires that have gone on to have harm. They absolutely have. Last year in the United States, we had 2 very notable cases in New Mexico that have created a lot of challenges, mischief, I would say, for prescribed fire to move forward. And so this is also part of us getting smarter faster. How do we learn where and when and how to burn in appropriate places? Because we know that prescribed fire is going to be a very important tool in our toolkit. When it comes to indigenous burning, I am less familiar, and I don't like to speak to practices that I am less familiar with there. And so I'll probably just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that Toddy is very popular in the question. So there's a question that I think is quite interesting, is about restoring the rural livelihood. Mm-hmm. Because I also think it would be very important to restore the rural livelihood. But they ask, how can we convince people to do it? Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I would love to hear from my colleagues down there too, because you deal with folks in rural areas as well, I know. But I think one of the challenges is we've really devalued rural living.
Yeah, I know.
And if you can't respect the people that live there and what they do, I think it's really hard to just ask them to be valued, like do more of what we don't value already. So we see historical trends towards urbanization, and we've been seeing these trends for decades now. And one of the unintended consequences is the devaluation of rural life and livelihood. I grew up in a rural community, and I no longer live there. Because I didn't see opportunities for me, and I think about my own brain drain from my own community. And I feel like it has to start with respecting what people do on the land, the value that they bring, whether it's forestry or farming, and the importance of that to our communities, and supporting, probably through more public subsidies, but that give value to that kind of work. Because unless we can bring and make the case for why people should be living on the land and taking care of the land, it's going to be really hard for us to accomplish the broad-scale land use management and changes that we need to take place. We can't do it all from a central government. We need people and rural livelihoods and people that can actually do that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's good to be a bit old. So I remember when I was young, we would get jobs as foresters in the country. Nowadays, everyone has most of the jobs in the urban areas, and they visit the people. So they do not have the same relationship with the rural people. And I agree with you that we have to give value to the rural work, and also to give facilities to people living in rural areas, because I'm from a rural area, and it's difficult to have a good internet in these places, for instance. So no one wants to move to a place like that. So if politicians would create better living, people living in the town, there's a lot of people liking the nature and things like that. If they would have good conditions in the rural areas, I believe then some of them would move. That's my idea. But I would like to listen to your ideas.
I think it's also linked to the sensibility of the policies that we create or we implement as well, and how restrictive through those policies living on the rural lands or managing the rural lands becomes. So, fire is, there's good fire and bad fire. Fire is an incredibly important land management tool. So we've got to be really careful with the policies and processes that we put in place around how we manage that risk for controls around the use of the fire, times of that, the conditions of how that occurs, that we don't lose that flexibility or that ability to use the tool. So I think, again, it comes back to that engagement with land managers and stakeholders who own the risk because they live in those areas.
Yeah.
To work with them to say, well, look, this is the issue. This is how we're trying to manage it. What's the pros and cons of this? How does this work? To actually get practical policy that actually resolves the issue but doesn't cause unintended consequences, such as the disconnection of people being able to live with the land.
Yes, I think just to add on, again to refer to the model that I used, how do you promote the use of good fire? That will first of all slot into the focal area of education, firstly, and the third one, which is economic incentives. So you educate, again, at all levels and raise that awareness, and then obviously provide economic incentives to promote the use of the tool. So within our cycle, that is where that will typically fit in and be slotted in, depending on the situation. But it's, again, educating at all levels, raising that awareness, and providing some form of incentive.
So I have a question to Tim. To Tim's point, they don't say which point. How do we get better of sharing meaningful information, data, knowledge, and research in a way which is accessible to our global village?
Look, and I think that varies depending on who we're talking about, because if we're talking about rural communities, as you just talked about, broadband and those sorts of things, those tools aren't necessarily prevalent in those places. Actually, face-to-face engagement is probably one of the best tools, to be honest, because that gives you a dialogue between two parties rather than just one-way traffic. I remember when I did a study tour to Mexico, and we were talking about communicating wildfire risk or communicating prevention messaging. And one of the people said, you've got so many different languages in Mexico. How do you communicate? How do you, what's the publications or what's the pamphlets when you've got so many different languages? And they said, it's really simple. We go out and have a conversation. And that, I think, actually boils it down to the simplicity of actually, if you actually want to have an engagement, then have an engagement. Don't send them a letter or an email or have a phone conversation or have a face-to-face conversation to actually really get that detailed engagement. And then I think within that there's levels of, and this picking up, I guess, your point, where that needs to happen at a local level as much as it needs to happen at the district, the region, and the national or the governance level. Because unless all of those different layers are connected up at the right levels, having the conversations they need to, the system is going to break down.
Yeah, and as was mentioning one of the colleagues that gave a talk in this session, the first time we talk with people in rural areas, maybe they do not listen. You have to go there many times, till they get trust in you, and then they start to believe and to change. So it's a long procedure. Yes. Then I think that there's many questions that I can summarize, and they are for Toddy. So people would like to have some examples how your 5 principles can be applied in a real case.
Yeah. So, part of the joy of getting ready for this conference was the opportunity just to think in a more synthetic way about what has been going on in wildland fire governance and governance at large and how I could bring some insight to this conference. And so, actually, I think the way to go forward on that one, I cited the one example from Colorado. I would really like to put together a working group of like-minded people that is interested in developing these case studies. And then maybe at the next conference we have a panel that could move that forward. And so if there's anybody actually that's interested in joining in or doing that kind of work, I would love to hear from you, because the literature is voluminous, and there's no way a single person can do this work. And if there are other people that are interested in trying to figure out what we might do on that front, I would invite you to be part of a group that we might move forward on that front.
Yeah. And so one question is about fragmentation. We all talk about fragmentation in our countries. How to implement a resilient landscape having fragmentation? How do you think, any of you, that how can we pick in a place that is owned by many, many people and to implement a fire resilient landscape? That's a challenge.
I mean, I would love to hear from both of you. You guys have to deal with
Yeah.
it on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Tim, yeah, I don't know. Can I call a friend? I think the key is communication at all levels and with stakeholders and all involved in addressing the problem. So we have specific working groups for communication, and they should be utilized to communicate, to do exactly that, and reach as far as possible. And there are certainly communities or stakeholders that are not being reached at this moment, and we should identify those and specifically target them at a local and a regional level, and then ultimately at a global level as well. And that is why events like this is so important, to communicate the message and to reach those that are still have not heard the message. So I think communication for me is key in addressing it.
For me, I guess, the challenge is, I guess, and it's been brought up a couple of times with other speakers, is that a lot of times when we're ready to engage with an audience, that audience isn't necessarily ready to engage with us. So often the timing of some of that engagement isn't as aligned, and that's possibly part of the challenge. I think the other thing is, when you look in the global space, fire is one hazard, and a multitude of other hazards, other priorities, other things that people are trying to contend with. And where fire then sits on their radar is going to be very much dependent on how they perceive that risk and then what they think that consequence is going to be to them in comparison to a lot of the other challenges that they're facing. So I think there's a part there where you can say, well, we'll just wait to the timing of when they're ready to receive that information. The challenge is tomorrow the fire occurs and you haven't had that conversation. I think the other opportunity there is around how we partner or work with some of those other organisations, so that rather than me going and talking to one community about fire one day and my neighbour going and having to talk to them about flooding or something else the next day, it's how we try and package up a lot of those hazards, because in many cases the thing that we want the public to do is not often all that dissimilar in terms of, if there's a hazard that's threatening your life, then you evacuate, regardless of whether it's a flood or fire or something else. So I think there's a bit of work that we can actually do amongst ourselves in terms of working smarter and not necessarily wasting our audience's time with this works for me, so it's now going to work for you. I'm doing a piece of work at the moment which is looking at how do we communicate fire danger information, because when I look back through the legacy of tools that we've developed, they've all been developed by fire specialists, and they've all been in the context of, I know the material really well, so therefore I know how best we're going to push this out so you'll understand it. What I want to turn that around is actually, you're the community. How do you want to receive this information? What do you want to receive? When I give you this message, how do you interpret that, and what do you do with that? I think we've got to tailor a lot of our solutions more from the end user rather than us pushing out great ideas and thinking, job done, haven't we done well? Because the reality is, when you look at the preparedness of a lot of the communities, they are underprepared, which means our messaging, our tools are not hitting the mark. So as that firescape increases in hazard with climate change and some of the other challenges that we're facing, we absolutely have to turn that round sooner rather than later.
Would you like to add something?
Well, I would say, fragmentation is something that is irresolvable given the complexity of the problem. So you're never going to solve it. You can only manage for it. So I think it's important to embrace that from the outset. Like, this is not a problem you're trying to solve. You are basically just trying to manage for it. And that I think the most, we want to build integration at the horizontal level, and we're trying to build integration along a vertical axis as well. So we need to have good collaboration at the community level, so we've got all the right players and actors. And one of the areas where I've done a lot of primary research has been using social network analysis as a tool to understand who's connected to whom and how, and where do we have gaps in that or structural holes in the lingo of social network analysis, and where do we see connection. And so those are tools that help us understand and bridge that kind of fragmentation. And the same thing when we think about the vertical axis as well. It's not enough to be only integrated at the local level. We need to be integrated through sort of the hierarchy of what is a polycentric system, a multi-level system. And because of that, you need ladders and scaffolding that are going to bring things together from those perspectives as well. Those are highly conceptual concepts, and I think they come together best when we have very concrete examples of how communities have bridged those gaps.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, just one more thing to add on to that around, we've got great technology now that's advanced from where it used to be. So we can create virtual and augmented realities that can help showcase the hazard, the implications and consequence of it. I was talking to a group a number of years ago, and we were talking about, look, if a fire goes through this area, there's a high likelihood you'll lose your house. And they said, well, that's fine because it's insured. As long as the family survives, then we're fine. A few years later, a fire did go through there. It took out a couple of houses, and the people, were absolutely enraged that they lost their house. Yet, despite us having those conversations earlier that the family was safe, you lost a house, but it was insured. So I think people really struggle with when we talk about some of the implications or some of the impacts to really visualise or actually really comprehend some of that consequence or impact. So I think that's where we can use some of the technologies that we've got, like the fire growth modelling tools, the virtual and augmented realities, to actually simulate or actually demonstrate in a much more practical or impactful way that helps them actually understand the consequence of what we're saying and why they need to care about these mitigations.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. So now I have one question that I think is interesting. How to avoid that fire risk reduction will not work against needed actions to solve other crises like biodiversity, for instance. So because they think, it's someone from Portugal, that fuel breaks, contention areas, etc., they are not working in the right direction because they are driving a lot of degradation and destruction.
So the tension between wildfire and biodiversity and how those come into tension with each other?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is, again, I'll come back to the United States and how some of these tensions are prevalent there. We see conflict among a variety of nonprofit groups, especially environmental groups, who want to, I would say, block work that is to do hazardous fuels. So what you have in tension are communities that may want to be doing work in the wildland-urban interface so they can protect the human community, and then you have, and this is an oversimplification, environmental groups who basically want to block that work because they are concerned about biodiversity. And so I think there's truth on both of those sides, but if you have a large-scale catastrophic fire that comes through and takes everything out, everybody loses. Mm-hmm. But I think that's seen usually as a low probability event and not as compelling, basically, to undertake that action. I think that where we have seen perhaps the best solutions is where you bring those groups together on the ground and you actually look at the dirt and the trees together and understand what the consequences are, because that's how you actually, instead of talking about these problems in the abstract and conceptually, which gives you a lot of oxygen to fight and brings very little light to the actual challenges on the ground. When you get people down on the ground, it sort of goes right back to your point, like when we talk to each other face to face and we have to look each other in the eye. It's a lot easier to get to a common sense solution than when we are fighting in the courtrooms.
Yeah, now I have a question. You can talk.
It's a comment on this topic, because we are seeing in Europe, we do this yearly report, and then we report on the impact of fires in protected areas, Natura 2000. And there is a clear link. So in 2022, 40% of the 900,000 hectares were burned within Natura 2000. So there is a prior probability of having a fire much higher within protected areas than outside, because in total, the protected areas are really a very small percentage compared to the total area of the EU.
And do you have data on the severity of those fires as well, in terms of how severe they're burning? Because that also has implications.
Yes, we do. We compute the severity, fire severity analysis for every fire after the fire.
Yeah.
So we have that, and there is now a paper on preparation. They're looking on the effects of fires in biodiversity and the probability that the wood could be a trigger to have a more intense fire. But the problem is, I think, there we are missing data. We don't have enough data of the amount of dead wood in protected areas that would allow to then determine if the amount of fuel is really the one, yes. So.
Yeah, so I have a question just for you. If someone is asking, what are some of the key data gaps that we have and that should be prioritized so we are responsive to EU policies?
I think, for me, one of the important data gaps are on the economics of fires, because there are no data. There are no data in the countries there is some data on the investments. On firefighting, there is very little on investment on fire prevention. So in economics, we are really weak. And there is very little information on valuation of losses, really complete analysis. For instance, we cannot evaluate the value of biodiversity. Yeah. So we treat areas within protected areas as those outside protected areas, because the studies that are available are really local, and they cannot be extrapolated. Yeah. So we are missing really the economics of fires. We have to work on it.
It's very important. I see some academics in the audience, so it's a good time for the new research project, just to get the information that is missing. Yeah, so and talking about economics, at least here in Portugal, that's a real problem, is the profitability of managing the forest. So we complain that forests are not well managed, but then when we do an economic analysis, the landowners are just smart. They don't manage because they don't spend anything and they can make some money. If they manage, the probability of having a negative income will be very high. So politicians should look at that.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge is the language that we use. So, we're quite heavily geared that when we're talking about, some of those costs, we're talking about costs from fire events.
Yeah.
And then obviously as a result of that, they understand, well, that's why we need to invest, etc. It's a really hard conversation around prevention and preparedness, because there's costs associated with undertaking risk reduction activities, there's costs associated with putting in place preparedness arrangements. It's really hard to explain what the benefit is in terms of a dollar value when there hasn't been the event or the outcome. So in terms of the economic space, there is quite a bit of work to be done around how we the language or how we describe some of the value associated with, the readiness and reduction.
I think from where I sit, I think it's not so much a management problem as what is a leadership problem. We have systems in place, but there's often a lack of leadership to provide the direction of where the system should go and how the system should be integrated. So for me, there's a question of leadership as well that has to be addressed in the wildfire problem.
Yeah, I think a final question, because we are almost running out of time, for Jesus. Can you provide what-if scenarios for the EU on fire impacts with global temperatures increasing by 2 and 3 degrees?
By 20.
They don't say when. So you can answer for
I
where you want.
I don't think we need 20. In fact, last week we had the meeting with the Civil Protection Expert Group, and then again this week with the expert group on the environment. And we are looking at the forecast. We have the probabilistic forecast for the next months, and we have a above average temperature for the whole season until October, according to this forecast. And that will be really devastating with the drought we have had until now. If this confirmed, probability of rain is very low in the Mediterranean region every year. So we don't need 20 degrees, we need just a couple of degrees, and that could be really a disaster. And we've seen that there is a really very high correlation between the values of, very high values of the fire danger, fire weather index, and extreme fires. So all the fires that are above 10,000, 20,000, they always happen with extreme fire weather index values. And they are going to happen this summer, and they're getting more frequent every summer. Yeah, that's why we had 2021, we had a peak of fires in the middle of the summer that was really unprecedented. Last year, we had the second worst year after 2017. So we are, all these years are really grouped in the last decade. So we are seeing a very fast change of climate change, much faster than we expected. Yeah.
So you do not expect a nice future, maybe.
No.
I don't know. So I don't know if any one of you want to say some final comment.
You know, I will say that sometimes I like to think if we had made similar investments in developing our local capacity that we have made in investing in technology to address wildland fire, that we might be in a very, very different place.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes back, and this is to take nothing away from science and technology, on that side. We absolutely need that. But we have underinvested consistently in the social capital and the just the capacity we need at the local levels to tackle this problem. And if that is one thing that we could do, I think that would pay enormous benefits into the future for us.
Yeah, you are right. I usually say that our problem is not technical, it's socio-economic, and it's much more difficult to deal with people than with trees. That's our big problem. Yeah. Jesus?
Yeah. For me, the comment is that we have already a lot of data, and the data show exactly what you are saying, what you were saying, that there has not been real investment in the rural areas, and that's where the problem comes. So we know where the problem is. We have data that proves it. We just don't have the access to eliminate this problem. So the problem is lack of management. Many of the abandoned areas around the cities are now colonized by forests that are not managed because they're not profitable. Yeah. So we know where the problem is, and we have the data. Yeah. But I am optimistic. We have to keep on pushing policymakers to make it very evident, because people are really being threatened by fires. They're being killed. So it's something that has to be tackled. Yes.
Yeah, Tim?
I think we're living in an incredibly dynamic environment. And I think if you look at the definition of stupidity, it's continuing to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So absolutely we need to be bold in terms of thinking differently, working in different ways, but I think the absolute key to that is working together.
Yeah. Etienne?
I think to add on to what Talia said, the suppression culture, the overinvestment in the suppression has actually resulted in the neglect at the local level where it's actually needed, where risk reduction can make a difference.
Yeah.
So we're actually seeing the effect of the suppression culture. That is now, this is where we are. And that's something that we have to reverse. We have to be more proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thank all we had speakers and panelists. It's a strange format, but I think we should give a hand of applause to all of them because of this interesting discussion. Thank you.